Hello. In this video, I will talk about research design. In particular, I will talk about different types of research design. Basically, there are many different ways of how to categorize research designs. It has been somewhat common to distinguish between quantitative and qualitative research. Here in this video, I will use a more fine-grained categorization, distinguishing between 5 different types. First, correlational. Second, experimental. Third, meta-analysis. Fourth, qualitative. And fifth, review. In the following, I will explain each of these different types in more detail. Let me start with correlational research designs. These types of studies are very common in social science because including also international management, human resource management, sociology and so forth, because we very often look at something that happens in real life. Such as in human resource management, it's about pay rise, how does it affect that employee motivation and so forth. And that's very difficult to reproduce in a laboratory. So what we commonly use would be a field survey, meaning we would distribute questionnaires to employees, to people, or it could also be secondary data that is available from a database and so forth, and that we will analyze. Very often in this type of research, we propose hypotheses, and then we test these hypotheses on our given data. What is very typical in this type of research is that we cannot control the setting. We cannot really control the independent, depending or any control variables. Of course, we would measure many different variables. In a survey, there can be maybe 80 to 100 questions we ask. Also, databases can be very rich and including hundreds of different variables. So we have many variables we measure, and then we can put them in relation. Statistically, that could be in a very simple way. We can run some correlation analysis, but it can also be regressions or all kinds of multivariate data analysis or group comparisons. These are all very typical statistical analyses that we can test or use on our data and test our hypotheses. These studies usually have in common we cannot establish causality. Now, of course, there are studies and particular economists that they claim, oh yeah, we do this and that, and we establish, or we almost establish causality. They can claim that, but even they are aware that this would be very difficult with these kind of research designs. So we measure many different variables and put them in relation to one another. Yeah, as already mentioned, we cannot truly establish causality. Nevertheless, there are different ways how we can get closer to it. That we can say that causality, even though we cannot fully establish it, but we can rule out alternative claims. So to improve or increase causality claims, there are different steps. And these are as old as John Stuart Mill from the 19th century. You see a picture of him at the very bottom of this PowerPoint slide. And there's certain conditions. The first one would be the covariation rule. That means two variables, x and y, must be correlated. That suggests there could be some causality, but it's important to point out that's not a sufficient condition. There can be other reasons behind maybe a coincidental or significant correlation between two variables. Another claim that would help to establish causality would be temporal precedence rule. So if we have one variable causes another variable, it should be also a temporal division. So x happens first, the cause. I drop an item, and then it falls down and breaks 1 second later. So x is cause and y is then that happens after x has happened. That can also be modeled in surveys, so that we have a survey we will ask people now, and then maybe 3 months later we have another survey and see how people react 3 months later. I have a session later on where I explain about 8M, different research designs, also longitudinal research and so forth, to increase causality claims. Another third point that is also very important is the internal validity rule. as it states that there could be other reasons why we see that relationship. I remember when I was a student, one of my professors in China was telling me this one example. He said, that was I think more than 20 years ago in China, people with blue eyes earn more money than people with brown eyes. And that you can test in correlations, regressions, and so forth, and you find this kind of relationship. Is that really the case? Is it some genetic order, or probably not? So the reason why people with blue eyes in China 20 years ago earned much more than people with brown eyes was very simple. Because these blue-eyed people, they were expatriates working for multinational corporations. They were CEOs, and they earned on average much more than a Chinese farmer or a Chinese factory worker. So it's not because of the color of the eyes, but because of another reason that is behind. And hence we also have to be very careful to make these causality claims, because if we would imagine, yes, look, my regression, it shows blue-colored people with blue eyes earn more money. Now everyone needs to get a surgery or wear contact lenses to appear to have blue eyes, and then they will earn more money. That's of course nonsense. Yeah, and that is exactly this internal validity rule. So we need to control for other variables that can explain the relationship. We would say we add control variables. All right. And as I mentioned, there's another session much later on typical common mistakes of research design and what can be done to prevent all these kind of challenges. Okay, moving on to next, second, experimental designs. Yeah, they're very common. I think also you see the picture at the very bottom. Yeah, in medicine, biology, and so forth, where people conduct experiments. They conduct experiments on animals, on human beings, and so forth. If so, we can really control our variables. We can add a manipulation, and then we can test for causality. And that will then decrease ambiguity. We can distinguish between laboratory and field experiment. As the terms suggest, a laboratory experiment takes place in a laboratory. It can be in a medical laboratory, but it can also be in a classroom. It's very common in psychology that professors or researchers, they ask undergraduate students to participate in an experiment, and then they randomly assign people, and then they run some tests on people and then on others without the intervention. The field experiment is if it's in an actual setting. That could be, for instance, if we think more now of organizational research, that we look into companies. One example could be a company introduces a new language policy. A new English corporate language is introduced, and the company has 5 subsidiaries. And this new policy is introduced in 2 subsidiaries, but not in the other 3 subsidiaries. And then we can compare these different subsidiaries. So in real life settings, in companies and so forth, we conduct also a manipulation, an experiment, and then we have a control group. And the big advantage of these experimental designs is that we can establish causality. As I mentioned, we have a manipulation or a treatment, and then another group that does not receive treatment. And then we can compare. Also in experiments, we usually compare before and after. Before, all same, and then one group receives the treatment and the other does not, and then we can investigate the factor that had an effect or not. And we can try to control for all other factors. We can try to hold that constant, particularly in a laboratory setting. To give you some more ideas how that could work, here I have an overview. You can see in the table, we have the different types of participants. We have the experimental group, the control group, and the placebo group. And here again, we have, it goes over time. We have time 1 before the treatment, time 2 the treatment, and time 3 after the treatment. At time 1, everyone gets examined. And so we compare if, for instance, we can look into English language abilities. We would run a test. Every participant would take a test, such as TOEFL and so forth. And then we have time 2, we have treatment. So the experimental group receives some treatment, instruction, training, all kinds of different training programs. The control group receives no training. And then maybe the third group receives some placebo, some fake training that is not really related to improving English proficiency and so forth. And then let's say 6 months later, we have another test. All participants, they do another English test. And then we can compare whether the training we provided really improved their abilities or not in the control group. And we can compare these three different groups. These type of experiments are very common, as I mentioned, medical science, biology, and so forth, in psychology, but also becoming more popular in organization studies. There are a couple of challenges with these experiments. Here at the bottom, I wrote down a couple of them. We have an experimenter bias, because maybe you run the experiments and you know what kind of results you would like to see. It could mean that you might influence or bias your respondents. To avoid that, usually the researcher who would like to test and run the experiments would not do it he or her himself, but instead ask another researcher to run the test. And then the experimenter does not know which group he's working with, the experimental, control, or placebo group. So it's a double-blind test. No one knows about the effect and the outcome that is being expected. A second point would be biasing events that happen during experiment. There are many things that happen. Take again the example of this English experiment. Imagine suddenly all of these or some of these participants, they meet many friends from America, from elsewhere, and they have lots of contact and practice. We would like to avoid such bias as much as possible. A third point would be selection bias. For this experiment, we would usually assign participants randomly into these different groups. We don't want a selection bias, and that should be ideally randomly. A fourth point would be experimental mortality. That would mean from time 1 to time 3, some participants do not participate anymore. They drop out. We don't get their response in time 3 anymore. And then it would be important to try to keep as many people as possible. All right, let's move on to third, qualitative research design. In another session, we have it's dedicated to qualitative research. Here, just a very brief introduction. The different types of qualitative research. What is very common is you have some interviews. It could be individual interviews, focus group interviews, and so forth. Then in research, we would usually transcribe all the interviews in detail, so that we can later analyze the data. It can also be other forms. It can be some kind of observation. We can also use some archival data. We could also use emails, newspapers, any kind of text content we could analyze. In organization research, it used to be very popular were case studies that we analyze companies, such as Samsung. How is Samsung doing this and that? Maybe compare it to Sony, interview people, and then also look into different documents from the company. Another also popular approach would be critical incident methodology, so that we look at specific events or incidents. Could be also critical ones. Qualitative research very helps at the early stage. It helps to develop some hypotheses. In particular, what is so useful is to gain some rich understanding of some phenomena and so forth. It could also help interpreting some specific results from an organization, or maybe also from some field research, from some correlational studies, trying to understand the underlying reasons. Qualitative research is also very often used to develop theory. You can apply groundbreaking theory approach. and then maybe it could prepare a follow-up quantitative study. Fourth, talking about meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is essentially a study that analyzes many existing studies. So typically you have a meta-analysis of the relationship between different attitudes and employee turnover. Maybe the meta-analysis then analyzes 100 studies. Each study maybe includes 200 or 300 respondents, and altogether a meta-analysis then analyzes 100,000 individuals and so forth, so a pooling of huge data sets. And then it's being analyzed statistically. To do so, we need correlation tables. So meta-analysis, usually they look into correlation tables and then aggregate it, and then they run different ways to analyze it. Meta-analysis are very helpful to develop theory and also identify research needs. And then in particular, it's important to establish validity and effectiveness of certain interventions. And some people also say it can replace large-scale research studies. Also, if you have difficulties collecting your own data, meta-analysis is also a good way to run some statistical analysis. It helps you identify these true relationship of sometimes conflicting results in prior studies. Coming to fifth, types of reviews. Essentially, you can distinguish into two major types. The first one is a systematic literature review. In a systematic literature review, you would, as the term implies, in a very systematic fashion, review the literature. What many scholars then do is they refer to certain databases, journals, and so forth, and they input keywords, they write down which keywords, and then, for instance, then they receive results. Maybe they put in this and that keyword into a database, and 500 articles pop up. And then they would filter these articles in terms of relevancy. Some people then again, they use statistical programs or graphical programs to show the overview of their findings, tables, and so forth. Then we have conceptual work. Here, the main purpose is to develop a new conceptual model or theoretical framework based on prior literature. Both types help in understanding the field. What's going on? What are the main directions? What are the arguments for and against sometimes? And then the contribution of the literature review would be to synthesize prior research, resolve inconsistencies, or in the conceptual work, develop a new framework based on prior research. And then it helps to identify gaps and future research directions. Both meta-analysis and reviews tend to be highly cited. Also, when you start a new project on a new topic, if you're lucky, you find a recent review or meta-analysis, and then you have a good idea of the field and about future research directions. All right, coming to an end. So in this video, I introduced the different research designs. Then, of course, it's up to you which research design you would like to apply. And that should be very much guided by your research questions or your hypothesis. I have other videos where I talk about the research design process and also about how to do then execute these different research designs. Thank you. Okay, that's it for today. Bye-bye.